Hey guys, back for another beauty video. I just spent a half an hour talking to a camera that wasn't on. It's true. So maybe you'll get a more efficient, condensed version now, because I'm not going to go again and repeat everything I just said to myself. Alright, so I wanted to go over a few loose ends. Of course, we have a couple hundred of those at this point, but I just wanted to touch on a few, probably create a few more loose ends in the process. So I wanted to talk about Immanuel Kant a bit more. We talked about him in class, and it's hard to emphasize how important he is as a thinker. Really, many people would say that philosophy is divided into pre-Kantian philosophy and post-Kantian philosophy. Once Kant comes along, his arguments and his insights, his challenges to the older philosophies are so profound that nearly everyone who comes after Kant has to deal with him. Either agree with him, either challenge him, or maybe transform some of his ideas, maybe adapt some of his ideas, but it's very, very difficult to ignore him. If you do, people will inevitably bring his views into relation to your own and make you face him. So let me remind you of what I was trying to say in class, because it's not an idea that anyone gets very quickly, I think. At least I have to say, for me, it took me quite a while to fully grasp what Kant was saying about the nature of human knowledge. So we talked about a book being on a table in front of us. I see the book, you see the book's there, no problem. Philosophers, since Socrates and Plato had asked about what are the conditions under which we can know that a book is on a table, that something happened in the past, any kind of knowledge. What is knowledge, and what has to happen, what has to be the case for us to know something, as opposed to just having an opinion? Well, with Kant, that question is changed and radically transformed. And let me just go over again what we talked about in class. Hopefully it'll sink in a little bit. The idea, even if you don't agree with it, you need to understand it. So the idea is something like this. Some people had said the world is just a dream. Material things are not real. All there is are ideas. That's pretty hard to live with that philosophy, with bumping into walls and things like that. But it's one possibility. Other people say there's nothing but material things, and that all our perceptions and feelings and thoughts and ideas are just illusions. It's all just material stuff. That's a very popular view today in the physics world, chemistry world perhaps, and beyond. So philosophers had come up with lots of theories about what's real and what's not. And of course, in Kant's time, the scientific revolution had started to put those theories to tests empirically in laboratories and in experimentation and observation, etc. But this is what Kant noticed, that no one else seems to have noticed before him. If we discard the dream theory of perception, right, and when we say, okay, there's probably us and there's probably a world beyond us. There's a world of things out there. And let's begin with the things that appear to be real around us, a book sitting on a table. How can I know that book, and I know that it's sitting on the table? How can I know that? And Kant noticed that if there is an external world, it'd be pretty strange to say the things in that world outside of me get transported into my head or into my mind in order for me to know them. So, no one throws the book at me and penetrates my head so that the book is inside my head and then I know it, right? Or perceive it. No, the book is still out there on the table. In fact, that's where I see it. So the book is out there, Kant says, and it stays out there. And yet I have an image of it, right? I perceive it. It looks purple, green, round, rectangular, whatever, right? I have an experience of it. And Kant realizes that there's a great gap between, you might say, a gap of explanation between the thing that's we believe is out there, the book, in and of itself, before I perceive it, and the book as I perceive it. Those are not the same thing. Again, the book doesn't fly into my head, so I perceive it, right? So the most obvious explanation has something to do with light, right? People noticed that a long time ago. So there's this invisible stuff called light, and it's flying around the world, bouncing off of things. And, the ancient Stoics, Greek and Roman thinkers had theories about this, and they thought that light was a kind of material or fluid that when it hit something, it would sort of take the shape of that thing, and then invisibly that shape would be transmitted to our eyes, and it would hit our eyes with that shape, and it kind of almost like an impression, right? And that the shape of that impression was then responsible for the shape of the image that we had, right? So the book is out there, it has a shape, the light hits it. Light is a kind of fluid like water maybe that takes the shape of things around it, and then that shape is transported, sort of sent to our eyes where it hits and gives a shape, an impression, and our minds say, aha, I know what that is because it has that shape. Well, modern physics, by the time of Kant, had already shown that light doesn't do this. It operates differently. We know today it has a wave pattern just up and down. It doesn't take a shape of things at all. So this is a profound question. How is it that the book stays out there, light travels right, like this, hits our eyes? There's nothing about this that says book, 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 right? It doesn't look like a book. It doesn't take the shape of a book. It's this. How can this, hitting my eye, produce what I see, which has this shape, right? A book or an apple. How is it that things without that shape could then produce within me ultimately the perception that I have, which has all of these specific shapes? Colors is another question. So Kant realized that this was his deep insight. He realized that we have experiences all the time, right? We walk around and we seem to be in a world beyond us, and it must be, influencing us. We hear things, we see, yet we know, again, that we're not seeing the thing. It's not flying into our heads. We're seeing light, which has this shape. How is it that when, light waves hit us, we know what to do with them? The missing link is whatever happens once it hits us and becomes what it obviously becomes, which is experience. We have experiences, all kinds of things. How do we know how to receive things that are not experiences, light waves, and transform them into experiences. Kant said, look at this, what I've discovered. That even in order to have an experience at all, we must possess knowledge. Now, he doesn't mean we are conscious of this. What he's saying is there must be something about the human organism. He thought he located it in the human mind. He thought this is something the mind has to do because, well, it's a long story. There's something about us, the human self, whether body or mind or brain or whatever, that somehow knows how to put all this jumble of sound and light and feeling together into one package, which we just call experience. There's a glass, there's a computer, the sky is up, here's my hand. Like, we experience these things. And yet experience seems to be based on our ability to put perceptions together into the form of a world and a shape and a place. Because we know, again, that even if there are places and things out there, they are not transporting their qualities into our heads, and they're certainly not transporting themselves into our heads. There's this intermediate thing called light and sound, etc. And once we get that, we have to know how to put it together so that we can have an experience. Okay. Think about it. You are in part responsible for the experiences that you have. I'm not talking about morality here. I'm talking about you are at work. There's something about you that knows how to work to put your experiences before you in a stable, meaningful way. We can certainly imagine that, our bodies could be hit with lots of light, our eyes could be hit with lots of light, and our eyes don't know what to do with that. Right? Possible to have an organism that is overwhelmed by what we might call sense data, right? By the world bombarding us with all of this stuff. Certainly possible, and we have experiences of this with people with mental illness and other problems where they can't put an experience together. They can't make sense of it. It's overwhelming, confusing, a kind of chaos of color and confusion. So experience itself must be grounded on some skills, some knowledge, some capacities for putting experience together, and that has to lie within us. It's not something the world can give to us. Think about it. Now, a couple points I want to make here. Why are we talking about Kant? Why are we talking about knowledge and experience and all of this? Well, because one of the things that you'll discover when you do philosophy, as you're already doing, is you might think that you can investigate one question, like what is beauty? But you'll soon find, as soon as you begin to investigate that question, it opens itself up to other questions. In this case, what is the nature of human experience? So when you begin to examine what is beauty, you have to ask, well, is beauty about emotions? Is beauty about ideas? Is beauty about self-expression? Whatever it is, you begin to look at, examples, etc., and you realize that, well, the only way I'm going to know that is to look more closely at our actual experiences with beauty, right? And that leads you to the question of, well, how do I know what my experience is? How can I understand the nature of experience? So you can't go wrong if you go to Immanuel Kant. It's one of the places to really wrestle with this question of human experience. A few implications of Kant's view. One is, again, he established a new question. What is the nature of experience itself? How does it work? Even if there's a world out there impinging upon us, once that happens, how do we know how to put things back together into objects, meaningful experiences. Secondly, this also means that our knowledge of the world is severely limited. I might want to know, what that candle over there is really like. Like if everyone who was conscious suddenly died, what would that candle be? Right? It's a question of what's reality in and of itself, independent of how it looks to us. And Kant says you can never know that. You can never know. You can have some opinions. So we have imaginations. He called it the capacity to reason. And what he meant by that was the capacity to think and argue about big ideas that we can never really experience. Like the three he mentioned were God, freedom, and immortality. Right? We can sort of think about living forever, think about living beyond this life. He says that's not an idea that you could ever bring into your experience and have knowledge of. You can speculate. And he says philosophers are really good at speculating, but that's all they're doing. They can never give us knowledge of those things. So our knowledge is severely limited to, in a sense, what we can experience. That's it. Finally, this also means that experience, and this is one of the things that Gadamer discusses quite directly, where he disagrees with Kant. But Kant would say that this also means that our experience, even the most normal, everyday, objective experiences of walking around and, playing catch or running through the park or whatever, like you're out in the world, you're doing stuff, you're not thinking about yourself. He's going to say all of those experiences are in great part subjective. And what he means by that is you, again, whatever that is, mind, brain, self, body, but you have been at work. Whenever you have an experience, you can know that you've been at work giving it structure, making it possible. When the world is bombarding you with whatever, then it's up to you to put it together in a way that says, this is an experience, right? This is what it is. It's up and down and here, front and back, etc. All of that is something you provide. Which is to say, all experience has a deeply subjective dimension to it. So one of the challenges for Kant is to try to show that it's not completely subjective. It has this subjective element, but it also has an objective element. But enough about Kant. Schopenhauer is a student in the next generation after Kant, and he really follows and agrees with most of Kant's ideas, and actually pushes them and becomes even more pessimistic than Kant. But as we saw in the essay today, he wants to say there is an escape. So all of our experience is limited, right? And the way he puts it, he just really changes some of Kant's terms, but it's basically Kant's picture. That again, the way he puts it is that everything that we experience is there because it seems important to us. Again, not only intellectually, we're not always aware of this, right? But we are creatures who desire relations, who desire, we are attracted to some things and we're repelled by other things. So the will at a fundamental level, just you might even think the raw will to survive, is that energy, is that force that sort of shapes our experience from the very bottom up. So he says we are always concerned with the relations of things, and what he mostly means by that is its relationship to us. Is it relevant or not? Some of this is conscious, most of it is not conscious. It's just built into the way we are. But we can escape this. We can escape this Not easily, but by trying to go set ourselves away from the hustle and bustle of life. Now, we can never set ourselves apart from the hustle and bustle of our own bodies and of time and of change and all of that. That's nature surging up within us, this voracious will, he calls it. We can never lose that completely. But we can, sort of have a beer, find a nice quiet place, and listen to some music. And if the music is composed by a genius, if the music is composed beautifully, there's a way in which our minds can escape our bodies, can forget about our own individuality, can participate in the patterns and the movements, not of the body, not of nature, none of that, but the patterns and movements in this kind of internal world of music, of the melody and the harmony. And in that forgetting of yourself, in that playful enjoyment of beautiful things, we gain a glimpse, at least, a little taste of something divine, something beyond human life and death, moment by moment change and struggle. And this is beauty. Right? Beauty is this realm of thought that we can escape to, but most of us need the aid of a genius. Most of us need the aid of someone who's crazy enough to really put the things of this world aside and really devote themselves full time to this realm of thought and beauty and patterns and ideas. And when they have sort of absorbed some of this and begun to understand it more fully, they come down, from the mountain and join us mere mortals and try to give us some glimpse of this beautiful realm, this true realm, through art. So when you are caught up in a beautiful piece of music and it overwhelms you and it just seems so gorgeous and so lovely, that's because a genius transported himself or herself sort of up to this realm, again, and through the imagination and through thought, but glimpsed something true and beautiful, and then came down and tried to represent that through physical things like sounds in music or colors in painting, and gives us a glimpse, a small, pathetic, nonetheless, a glimpse of something higher and truer. You can hear a lot of echoes of Plato in this. One difference, I think, a clear difference would be that Plato thought that we could gain knowledge of these ideas and that they could inform our everyday lives. Schopenhauer is much more pessimistic and thought, really, no, these ideas have no value. They have no practical value, but they're still true and beautiful. And so to touch them for a little while, to gain some access to them, to just appreciate them, be grateful that they're there, was all we could hope for. But when you get back into the real world of experience, it's all will, it's all change, it's all desire, and those ideas are really not going to change anything about that. Schopenhauer, the famous pessimist. I'd recommend him. He's a great writer, funny, penetrating insights. So, Schopenhauer. Dewey, also a Kantian, agrees with Kant, does not try to argue that Kant was wrong, that we can go beyond the limits of experience. He fully accepts Kant's insight, but he's not a pessimist at all. Dewey argues that Schopenhauer is wrong, and that if you really examine the nature of experience more carefully, just as Kant did, just as Schopenhauer did, right? All these philosophers now really have to deal with the nature of experience. Dewey thinks if you examine the nature of experience, you don't just find change, you don't just find raw will and desire surging up within us, that's there, but more than that, you find stable patterns, you find beginnings and endings, you find ups and downs, you find tensions, you find harmonies and disharmonies, compatibilities and conflicts. These are part of experiences. And Dewey thinks, you have to guess or figure out if he's right, Dewey thinks this is the stuff of art already. So think about a beautiful piece of music. It's got tensions, doesn't it? I mean, if music doesn't have any tension in it, it's just boring. So there's tension in music, beautiful music. There are conflicts. There's ups and downs and risings. There's quickenings and slowings, and right. There's all of these sort of patterned elements. Can be conflicts and harmonies, etc. Dewey thinks all of these things are sort of already there in experience. These are not the things we normally notice, but they're there. If you take your time and step back, you'll realize that your life, every day of your life, he's going to say, has beginnings and endings. The day itself, of course, you wake up, you go to sleep, but within that, there are little beginnings and little endings, and in between that is something like a story, a drama, right? And there are dramas and resolutions and conflicts and issues, and then it gets resolved and you move on. So you're just living out these little dramas, day by day, and that's what Shakespeare does, right? Shakespeare writes plays, have beginnings and endings, conflicts, tensions, dramas, with resolutions. So what Dewey wants to say is, even the most beautiful, high, sophisticated art like Shakespeare, right, Mozart, etc., they are not escaping from experience. They are not living in some other genius realm, right, of pure thought. They are exploring and intensifying and building on and transforming the elements of experience itself. They are playing with experience. They're not escaping from it. And that experience itself, even the most mundane, normal experiences of our lives, already possess many of the elements that make great art beautiful. So instead of seeing art as something separated from everyday life, Dewey wants to say, no. Art is a form of intensifying, exaggerating, exploring, pulling and twisting, and right, transforming all of the aesthetic, artistic elements that are already embedded in our daily lives. So, I find it interesting that both Schopenhauer and Dewey start with the same basic Kantian framework, that they accept that we can't know things beyond our experiences and that we have to begin with experience. But they describe experience quite differently. They both agree it's full of change. There's nothing solid and permanent in it. And yet Schopenhauer draws a certain conclusion from that, and Dewey draws the opposite conclusion. Right? They really are looking at the same thing, human experience, agreeing on some of the basic features, and yet saying this should tell us something completely different. In this case, about the nature of beauty. So, why does all this matter? Well, it's hard for me to imagine what matters more than asking ourselves carefully about the nature of human experience. What is it we're doing on this planet? When we experience the world, what is that? Is it more like a dream? Is it more like a computer program? Is it like, a story? Is it a piece of art? Is it just data hitting us and we process it, as a computer? What is the nature of human experience? This is the question that Kant inaugurated, and we're still wrestling with it. One more point. Gadamer, if you remember, the very first thing he does in the chapter we looked at, my apple juice. Gadamer pushes back, remember? He says, I'm not saying this and I'm not saying that. And if we normally think of this, and there are all these people who think about this, and I'm not going to agree with that. What was it that he was resisting? It was the subjective interpretation of aesthetics. Right? It was this, you remember? It's this idea that if we're going to talk about beauty, if we're going to talk about art, we need to talk about the mind, right? And what the mind does, and what happens to the mind when we appreciate or judge something to be beautiful. The subjective side of it, right? That all comes from Kant. It all comes from Kant, right? Kant said, you can't know about the world itself. All you can know is the world that you are presented with after the world hits you and you construct an experience. Your subjectivity, this whatever capacity you have inside you, it puts the world together in a certain way that you say, oh, there's an experience of a book. I see it, right? I perceive that book. The subjective element. Many, many people after Kant, writing about not only knowledge, but about ethics and about aesthetics, argued with Kant that the real question to deal with is, what's the nature of our subjectivity? What's the nature of this process that we have for giving experience its specific character? In this case, the character of something beautiful. It can't be the object, right? Because we don't have the object. All we have is the object as it's represented for us. The subjective side. Gadamer wants to push away from that. And I think it's interesting that one of the ways he does that, as we saw, is he doesn't go at beauty directly, right? Now he talks about that in the rest of the book as well, but he prefers to go to that question through the idea of play. And I think, I can sort of understand why he did that. Which is, the reason I see is that he discovered in play, if you go, okay, let's say this, you go to a museum, it's really, really easy to conclude that everyone has a different interpretation of a painting. Or people have very, very different impressions and different attitudes towards paintings. So it's too easy, I think, to fall back on the subjective, private interpretation of art and say beauty is in the eye of the beholder and there's nothing more you can say about it. With play, as we saw, now Gadamer doesn't think that's right, but he uses play to open up an entirely new field of possibilities, which I think we all got kind of excited about, at least I did last week, where we began to see that this thing that seemed sort of subjective from the beginning, kind of silly and frivolous, and no one's gonna say you're wrong if you like this kind of game over that kind of game, right? And we divide up into little tribes, and say I like basketball and I like, but we don't think that someone is wrong for liking other kinds of games. We think these are just private, personal attitudes, right? So we take something that seems to be so subjective and private, and within the space of, 12, 15 pages, Gadamer has demonstrated that games and playfulness is not something that we give the world. It's something that the world offers to us. Right? We don't create the game, and we don't create the playfulness of the game. The playfulness of the game requires a certain attitude from us, But our attitude doesn't create the game. It doesn't create the playfulness of the game. Each game has a distinctive playfulness of its own, whether we play it or not. Right? It requires players, but the players do not make the game, and the players do not make the spirit of the game. The spirit of the game is what it is. The players enter into the spirit of the game. Right? So when you see that, now you're really at a place where you can talk about perhaps beauty as well, aesthetics and art, which all contain a kind of playfulness in them. And you can begin to explore a meaningful way of understanding art and beauty that's not all about what's up in my head, right? It's not all about how I or we perceive and project and construct the world. But it's more about what we enter into, the world of joy, of play, of beauty that we enter into. And of course our minds are active. Of course we're involved, but we're not involved in the way Kant thought that we were involved. Like receiving stuff from the world and then putting it all together for ourselves. That cannot work. When you really look at play the way Gadamer did, you see that's not what a play is. That's not what playfulness is. That's not what a game is. It's not a subjective projection of our own attitudes. There's something bigger. There's something prior. There's something more to it that we really have to explore. So, Kant is the reason Gadamer had to begin that chapter by saying, I'm not saying it's subjective. I reject it. It's not all about the subject. It's about something more. He has to say that because for 150 years before Gadamer wrote that, Kant had influenced so many people to believe that it really was all subjective. All a matter of our own internal way of creating experience. That affected our views of knowledge, our views of religion, our views of ethics, our views of aesthetics, and Gadamer is pushing back against that. And play is the way he does it. Okay, I'm done. See you soon.